Welcome to Faith in the Fold, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today on the podcast, we have a special guest, my friend as of the last year or so, Alex Bernardo, host of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. He's going to join us today. We're going to talk about Christians and politics and all kinds of other things. Alex, welcome to the show, sir.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me today, man. I'm really excited to be here.
Me too. Just really quickly, I will tell everybody how we actually got to be acquaintances and friends. I think back in February when the Asbury revival stuff was going on, I bet some people are probably hearing this and thinking, "Oh yeah, that happened," right? That's how short our memories are. But back when that stuff was going on, I was tweeting about it because it was happening at the college across the street from where I got my doctorate. And I've got a good friend who's teaching New Testament there at Asbury College or Asbury University, and I've got plenty of other friends who are working in the school or working as students across the street at the seminary. And so I was aware of sort of what was going on. I think you maybe had seen some of my tweets about it, and we're also in conversation with some other people who were kind of questioning, maybe, or a little bit more skeptical about that. And I think we also ended up liking a lot of the same memes at some point. And so that was basically how we ended up meeting. Alex, tell us, what do you do? How did you get there? And tell us a little bit about your political journey to coming, I guess you could say, coming out as a libertarian.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this. I think it's a really important issue. I am right now a public school teacher, which is a very interesting career choice for a libertarian. And it's one of the reasons why I am a libertarian right now. But before I was a public school teacher, I was in ministry for 8 years. So I went to college and got my degree in biblical studies. And I was a bivocational minister. I worked in a couple of churches, a Methodist church and a Lutheran church as well that I had grown up in. And I did that for a very long time. And that definitely had a profound impact on my worldview. As far as my libertarian journey goes, I think I've always been a libertarian, even though I did not know what that philosophy was until about 7 or 8 years ago. And I remember when I was growing up, like, my mom and dad are really great people, like, just incredible. And I had a great childhood and everything, but I've always been very skeptical of authority. And I've always hated having people tell me what to do. And I'm not sure why that's the case. And I've also had this extreme need to be consistent, that if I'm going to believe in something, that my actions need to follow. And so we always went to church growing up, and we were in a Lutheran church when I was in middle school and high school, and I went through the confirmation process. And I, even though I'd gone to church, I didn't take my faith that seriously. But I remember when I got to the end of the confirmation process, we had the opportunity to stand up in front of the church and say whether or not we were confirmed. And I was the only kid that turned it down. I said no, because I knew that the life that I was living was, like, not consistent with the things that they wanted me to affirm in front of the church. But I had a really good mentor during that program, and he pushed me to read the Bible, which I eventually did. And I wound up realizing that, like, I need to take this Christian faith very seriously. I understand that this is legit. But I also, as I started reading through the Bible, I realized that, like, my faith was not something that somebody ever compelled me to do. Like, I chose to follow Jesus. I made that choice on my own. Nobody forced me to do it. And as I was reading through the Bible, I realized that that's, like, kind of the model for evangelism. Like, you can't force somebody to be a Christian. They have to make that choice on their own. Like, you put a gun to somebody's head and you say, "Hey, do you believe in Jesus?" And they say yes. They don't have faith. Like, that's not legitimate faith. They were forced to do that. And so when I was in high school, I realized that it was not my job to try to force other people to become Christians. It was my responsibility to witness through the way that I lived my life, and that they had to make the choice to follow Christ. And along with that observation came the realization that I couldn't police other people's behaviors. And so it didn't make a lot of sense for me as a Christian to assume that if someone did not have my Christian worldview, that they should live by all of the values that arise from my faith. So I shouldn't expect that other people would act like Christians, because they're not. And so I didn't have that expectation. And if I want someone to change their behavior, I should try to convince them through the way that I live my life. There was never any idea that we should use force. And, like, for my spiritual journey, I think Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the weeds, where Jesus says, the wheat and the weeds have to grow up together, and on the last day they'll be separated. I think that had a really profound impact on the way that I approached other people. I just realized that, like, they're always going to be unbelievers. That's just a part of the way things go. And I have a responsibility to testify to my faith, and maybe they'll accept it and maybe they won't. And as I got older, I think that idea started as I became more aware of politics and of my place in the world world. I think that was just an idea that I consistently held. And for a while when I was in college, I was like, this was during the height of the war on terror. And so, I graduated high school in 2007. So we're in the middle, the George Bush era. And I was raised in Kentucky, so had some conservative. I thought that I was conservative, but I was like, I really don't like all of the authoritarianism that I see coming from like the Bush administration. And then when it came to issues at the time that were emerging, like pot legalization and like gay marriage, I never smoked marijuana, and I go to a very traditional church where we don't ordain same-sex ministers. But I realized that again, like, I don't think that stuff should be illegal. Like, if you're not a Christian, then why should like you be restricted to my political values? And so I was in favor of same-sex marriage, not because I thought that it was morally appropriate for Christians, but because I felt like if you're not a Christian, you shouldn't be restricted by the law to follow my worldview. It just never made any sense to me that we would have to impose laws to make other people live by the standards of our faith. And so I went on and on and on in this journey, kind of not knowing where I was. And it was in the 2016 presidential race where I knew I wasn't going to vote for Donald Trump, and I knew I wasn't going to vote for Hillary Clinton. There's no way in the world I was going to do that. And I remember like coming home from work one day and thinking, I need to check out my other options. And Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate for president, was on Anderson Cooper, and he laid out all of his platforms on that show. And he was talking about lowering taxes and about decreasing the size of the military and about legalizing pot and about ensuring that same-sex couples have the same rights as everybody else. And I was like, politically, that is exactly what I am. I am a libertarian. And so from there on, I started to read and study and do more work. And this was at the same time I was getting my master's degree to become a teacher. And when I became a teacher, I started working at an inner city school. And I realized very quickly how the government bureaucracy actually held these kids back and made it impossible for them to learn the skills that they needed to be successful. And then I transitioned to more of a kind of a suburban/rural school. Where I teach right now is on the southern edge of our county. So we got a lot of farm kids, but then also a lot of kids from the suburbs. And I was there through the COVID pandemic. And I saw just over and over again how the bureaucracy really harmed our students. Regardless of what you think about what happened there were a lot of negative impacts that were not taken into consideration that our students are dealing with. And so I got more and more into libertarian philosophy. And I just realized that this seems to be the best way to approach politics and the best way to approach the problems that we face as a society. So I think that's my journey, and that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah. Yeah. We've had a lot of, I would say, shared experiences, or at least similar experiences. So I graduated high school in 2004. And so like I vividly remember, when 9/11 happened. I was in the AP World History when, the girl came in and said, turn on the TV, turn on the TV. They've hit the other tower or something like that. And nobody knew what was going on because nobody had smartphones, right? We weren't getting instant news notifications and everything else like that. And the TVs were off because we were about to start school. And then going on through college and, kind of seeing the war on terror for, as someone who was not particularly involved, I remember thinking at some point, this makes sense to me. Like this made sense to me in my worldview at the time. And then as we come into the 2008 election, where President Obama was, or then Senator Obama was campaigning, I remember thinking, man, there's just some things that are kind of off. Like I don't think this is the guy, right? Like this is not the guy for me. But I saw a lot of Christian friends, almost promote the guy like he was the second coming, right? And that really turned me off. It was really distasteful to me. But then, 8 years later, I saw the same level of devotion towards Donald Trump, and that was what was kind of the like the light bulb moment for me. It's like, what I found so distasteful in other folks, other Christians who thought that President Obama was God's gift to the American presidency, I see in equal measures, maybe greater or lesser, depending on what part of the country you're in, the same kind of devotion, the same quality of devotion towards Donald Trump. And in Christian friends who should know better, it's like, oh man, that's also not good. Neither of these are good options. Why can't we all see this? And then that was what kind of began my journey of feeling less comfortable naming myself in terms of the typical right and left political spectrum, and eventually kind of coming to be somewhat politically homeless. And so it seems like you've kind of experienced a similar sort of thing. You've mentioned libertarianism. What is it at a big picture level? Like, what kinds of things do libertarians believe? Like, what is maybe some of the moral underpinnings of that? Because I have heard people say, well, you can't legislate morality. I would agree in some respects, but I think I would also disagree in other respects because, for example, rape, theft, and murder have always been moral issues. And we do legislate against those because those things are patently and unequivocally immoral. And so, like, what are some of maybe the moral underpinnings of libertarianism? Help us kind of walk through what this thing is, and maybe address some of the stereotypes of what it isn't as well.
Yeah, libertarianism is a really big concept, and there is, surprise, surprise, a lot of disagreement among libertarians as to how we should define the term. So I'm going to be as general as possible in my definition here. But at its heart, libertarian is a belief in a principle called the non-aggression principle. And this is simply the idea that you do not have the right to initiate aggression against another adult human being, just as they do not have the right to initiate aggression against you. And so it's this space where you are an autonomous individual and you own all of your own choices. And as long as your choices do not impinge upon somebody else's ability to make decisions for themselves, then those choices should be allowed in society. And you also have to own the consequences of those choices. It's not somebody else's responsibility to come and clean up the messes that you have made. And that's the fundamental idea behind the non-aggression principle. So for libertarianism, we believe...
One real quick question, Alex. Sorry to talk over you. You had specified you should not initiate aggression towards an adult human being. You specified adult. Is there a reason for adult, or did you not mean to specify adult?
Oh, no. I mean, because as a libertarian, I believe you have a right to raise your kids.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And you have to discipline your kids, right? Yeah. But I mean, there are some libertarians that say that you can't punish your kids at all because, you don't have a right to aggress against them. But I do think that as a parent, it's and honestly, we have a God-given commission as Christians to raise our kids. That's what I mean by that.
That nuance makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also not in favor of beating children either. I don't want it to come off like that.
Right, yeah, like let's specify.
Yeah, I'm a public school teacher. I'm not in favor of violence against young children. So I just want to put that on the record.
That's the non-aggression principle, right? Like it's a severe curtailing of violence, essentially, right?
Yes. And there are a lot of different brands of libertarianism. They kind of range from the classical liberal spectrum, which is where I started. In a lot of ways, I still have strong leanings in that direction. And that's essentially the tradition of John Locke, that the only existence and the only purpose of government is to protect your natural rights, your rights to life, liberty, and property, and government shouldn't do anything other than that. And then you have a group of libertarians called the minarchists that believe that the government should be in control of just a very tiny fraction of things related to the protection of natural rights. And then there are anarchists, and I do have some leanings in that direction too, that believe that we don't need a state, and that basically every service that is provided by the state could be provided more efficiently privately. So there are a lot of arguments that are very compelling to me. I'm not sure if I'm there 100% yet, but at the end of the day, libertarians all agree that we need low taxes, if any taxes at all, that we should not have a massive aggressive military presence overseas. We believe in the rights of the individual, even the rights of individuals that don't agree with you or that don't share your worldview, to live in the way that they see fit. And we believe in free speech and freedom of association. It's just the ability for you to live your life in the way that you see fit, as long as you're not impeding somebody else's ability to live their life in the way that they see fit. And of course, that does lead to a lot of social discomforts. You have to learn how to tolerate the fact that there are going to be people that are living radically different lives than you, and that might be on TV or in the newspapers or writing books that promote values that you do not agree with. But as a libertarian, you believe in free speech and free association, so you can freely associate with people that are like-minded, and you also have the right to share your perspective with those that are in the public square. And I think that those are the fundamental tenets of libertarianism. And it's not an idea that is embodied by either major political party in the United States today.
Yeah. You specified some things that are essentially listed in the Bill of Rights, which, by the way, from a libertarian perspective, rights are inherent to humans. They're not things that are granted by the government. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this goes back to the fact that the Enlightenment tradition is rooted in the Western Christian tradition. You can look at like Isaac Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity were only possible because he believed that there was an intelligent creator that designed the universe with logic and order. And John Locke was the exact same way. Like John Locke's conception of natural rights comes from the belief that God, as creator, gave us all these natural rights. We have them simply because we are made in God's image and simply because we are alive.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a really important point to emphasize there, is that, you know, this has particularly come up quite a bit ever since 2020, where you know, people were very insistent on like not having their rights trampled on. Some others were saying, well, you know, the government has a right to take away your rights if it's for a greater cause or something along those lines. And there was, you know, like amongst all the noise of discussion about like what, you know, to mask or not to mask, and, you know, et cetera, I think one thing that might have gotten lost in some of that discussion, which eventually came to the forefront of the discussion, was, you know, the source of rights that are inherent to human beings. If you have a, you know, like broadly theistic worldview, and more particularly if you have a Christian worldview, then it does make sense that God, you know, gave you that, you know, humans are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And then, you know, chief among them are the things that you have listed. Those early documents of the founding of the U.S. are really fascinating to read from kind of a libertarian perspective.
Yeah.
You know, like I don't know. What do you think about that? Have I kind of captured correctly what you're thinking there?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the starting point for libertarianism is the classical liberal tradition of the Enlightenment and those values that are definitely derived from Christian culture, because I don't think that you get an idea of natural rights without there being some sort of conception of a transcendent creator and of the creation having value because they were created in that creator's image. I think the other aspect of this too that might be a little more philosophical, but I think is just as important, is that libertarianism at its heart is a critique of human power. And so libertarians do not believe that human beings have perfect knowledge. And so we don't believe that human beings have the ability to make decisions for everybody in society because they cannot foresee all of the negative consequences that might result from the decisions that they make. A really great parallel for Christians for this idea is Lord of the Rings. And so J.R.R. Tolkien was a medievalist, and he also had very anarchistic tendencies in his political thought. And the entire idea behind Lord of the Rings is that the ring represents power. And it doesn't matter if the good guys have the ring or the bad guys have the ring. Eventually, whoever wears it is going to be corrupted. And so what you have to do is get rid of that. And so power, if you go back to Genesis chapter 3, that's kind of the whole idea behind people eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and wanting to become like God. It's not about like sex or money or any of that stuff. It's about power. And that's the fundamental human sin. And there are no instances throughout human history where someone has been given an unlimited amount of power and used it to benefit other people in society. Power is always corruptive, and it always makes people act in ways that are dehumanizing. And so libertarians want to decentralize that power as much as possible. All right, power exists in the world. We can't get beyond that, but how do we limit the potentially damaging effects of power? And so at its heart, libertarianism is a critique of human power and our ability to exercise it without harming other people.
Yeah, yeah. You're by mentioning Genesis 3, you're touching on a little bit of what we're going to mention here in just a little bit. Let me ask, though, you've used this phrase a couple of times already, classical liberal and classical liberalism. How do we define that? Because the word liberal today has what I think is an exceedingly different connotation than it is within the phrase of classical liberal or classical liberalism. So what is that you keep talking about?
Yeah. So 18th century Enlightenment liberals were people that believed in exactly what I have been describing. They believed in limited government against the monarchies. They believed in low taxes. They believed in freedom of speech. They believed in the freedom of association. They believed in natural rights. That's the classical liberal tradition. And you're right. Over time, the word liberal has actually become associated with policies that have nothing to do with human freedom and actually have a lot to do with government authoritarianism.
Yeah.
So that language has shifted. But I do like to retain the term classical liberalism because it roots my political philosophy in its historical context. I think it's important to try to retain that language. And even though we have to recognize that it might be confusing, I appreciate you asking that follow-up question.
Yeah. I've I've been reflecting on this over the last maybe year or so, and I've I think I'm more comfortable these days saying that what the term liberal has come to mean is really a liberal use of state power and authority.
Mhm.
Where liberalism meant, like what you said, the inherent rights of the individual, the freedom of the individual. What I think it's come to mean these days is, a or you could take progressivism or progressive along the same lines, where if we use liberal and progressive to refer to, kind of the leftmost, side of the political spectrum, of the right left spectrum, then progressive and liberal tend to mean, a progressive use of state power, and a liberal, or I don't necessarily want to say wanton use of state power, but that is probably appropriate in some instances, particularly in other parts of the world. I'm workshopping that a little bit, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and it absolutely does. And again, I think the use of liberal to describe progressivism in the United States is unique to the United States. I think it's either in Australia or New Zealand, but their version of the Libertarian Party, they're called the Liberal Democrats, which in the United States refers to a completely different political philosophy than libertarianism. So it just depends. Yeah. But again, going back to the way that like those parliamentary systems work, like they're retaining the language of the Enlightenment to describe their political philosophy when those words have come to mean different things in American political discourse. I do think progressive is the best way to describe the modern left right now, because it does have historical antecedents in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the idea behind progressivism is that there is a goal out there for the human race, and that we can only progress towards those goals if the government directs and controls the course of history. So that's the idea behind the progressive movement. And you can see that at the very end of the 19th and the early 20th century with the progressive era. That was the philosophy that undergirded that entire movement. It was the idea that because the Enlightenment had delivered the goods, so to speak, the Enlightenment had been so good at producing all of these scientific advancements that if we applied the language and the method of science to politics, then we can progressively make the world a better place. And the only way that we can do that is by having a scientific government that directs the course of history. And that's where I think that ideology of the left right now, that's why it can be appropriately deemed as progressivism, because there is this belief that the only way that we can create progress as human beings is through centralized power.
Yeah. Yeah. You would think that 20th century history might show that actually doesn't pan out. So,
yes.
Yes.
And I'm sure we'll talk about it later on the show, but there are a lot of libertarian philosophers that have made that exact point.
Right. Yeah. Oh goodness. I was on Twitter /X maybe last week sometime, and I saw somebody, maybe they were just kind of speaking hyperbolically, because it's Twitter, and so you, unless you pay for it, you only have a limited amount of characters. But they were saying that they find it so hard to argue with Marxists, because every time he says, the problem with Marxism is the extraordinary body count, and they respond, yeah, but it's like, wait, no. Like, 20th century history is pretty clear that this is such a dangerous experiment that it's not worth trying.
Yeah.
So I one would think, right? One would think that, if we're going to, be sensitive towards the use of power, then continuing to concentrate it in the hands of those who can also wield extraordinary violence is a bad idea. But that hasn't quite caught on everywhere.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
All right. As a Christian, does libertarianism have any? Do you see that libertarianism has any biblical basis? I mean, you mentioned Genesis 3 and the curse of humanity. What either flesh that out a little bit for us, or what else would you look at and say, like, hey, I really think that this is sort of the biblical underpinnings of why I look at the world this way?
Yes, I love that question, and I'm going to answer it both yes and no.
All right.
So, and I want to start with the no first. So, libertarianism is not a biblical philosophy in the sense that libertarianism is a completely modern philosophical and political construct. In the same way that conservatism and progressivism and capitalism and socialism, all of these are modern ideas. And I think that one of the biggest problems that we face in the modern church is that we project all of our post-Enlightenment ideas back into the New Testament, and they just thought in completely different categories than we did in the modern world. There are a lot of libertarians that are guilty of trying to force the Bible to affirm this comprehensive libertarian philosophy, but it doesn't do that because it can't. Like, that wasn't the world in which it was written, and so we have to appreciate that there is a 2,000-year gap with lots of historical events in between where we are now and what was taking place in the first century, and not import all of our modern ideas back into antiquity. The good thing about answering that question in the negative, no, libertarianism is not a strictly biblical principle, is that, as I said before, that applies to every other modern political philosophy. None of them are, strictly speaking, outlined in the Bible, because they all come from assumptions that were not generated until the Enlightenment. So I would say that as outlined as an articulated doctrine in the Bible, no, it is not. But I do think that a lot of the principles of libertarianism are found in the Bible. And for me, I went to Bible college in 2007, and I graduated in 2012. So this was right at the time that anti-imperial studies and New Testament studies was becoming very popular.
Mm-hmm.
And so I read a lot of people like N.T. Wright. He was very influential in my early days, not so much now as I've
You mentioned
grown a
that to some other point where I think
I
either
know.
on Twitter or something like that. We might get into that a little bit, because he's generally a fan favorite.
Yeah, I think N.T. Wright, when he's right, he is on point, and when he's wrong, he is real wrong. But reading a lot of N.T. Wright, and then Michael Gorman and James Dunn at the time, and Richard Bauckham, like all of those kind of guys, and thinking through how I understood the kingdom of God and how I understood New Testament ecclesiology and soteriology, that really made me think about my commitments to politics. And so when I look at the Bible, you have the Old Testament. Obviously, you have the fall of man, which is all about man trying to become like God. And then God calls Abraham's family to undo all of the problems of man's sin. And Abraham's family, Israel, winds up failing. But throughout that process, God promises that one day he will send a son of David to come and rescue all of his people. And in the New Testament, we believe that happens with the life, death, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. All right.
And ascension. So, I'm glad to hear you mention that, man. That's such a key point. Yeah, I think Matthew Bates does a great job making that, and plenty of other people as well, but particularly Matthew Bates. I know that's a guy who's been on my show and your show as well.
Yes, yeah. And Patrick Schreiner has a great book on the Ascension that I read last year. And that really opened up Hebrews for me. A lot of the hermeneutical problems I had with the book of Hebrews were made very clear once I understood the place that the Ascension had in that. But I think the conclusion that we can draw from that from a big picture perspective is that Abraham's family, as Paul says in Galatians 3 and in Romans chapter 4, is defined by faith in the Messiah. So how do you tell who one of God's people are? Well, these are people that put their faith in Jesus, and that makes us a part of the united family of Abraham. As Paul says in Galatians 3:28, there's no Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. We're all one in Christ Jesus, and we're all part of the family of Abraham. So that is our primary identity as Christians. And because of that, if you look at the way that Paul uses the language in the ancient world, that means that our identity is not to our nation. It's not to our tribe. It's not to our ethnicity. It's not to any of our social status or any of that stuff. The only identity that matters is the identity that we have in Christ. And that is what bonds us to every other Christian. So you have that aspect, the ecclesiological aspect of it. And then the gospel is centered on, you had Matthew Bates on your show a couple weeks ago, the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, is what Paul says in Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 15 and 2 Timothy 2, that his gospel is about Jesus being the Messiah and dying for our sins and being raised in power. And so we believe that Jesus is the only legitimate king. And as the only legitimate king, he redefines what it means to wield power. So you got like really incredible passages like Philippians chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 5, where the writers of the Bible explicitly state that Jesus derives his power from the fact that he was willing to make sacrifices for people that didn't deserve it. That's what real power looks like. It's not lording over other people. It's not trying to dominate them. It's not forcing them to do things that they don't want to do. It's by serving them through sacrificial love. And so I think when you combine all of those aspects together, that gets you to a kind of a libertarian take on society. All right, so we only believe that Jesus is the king, so our allegiance to our nation or our country, that's completely irrelevant. Like, my status as an American does not matter at all. And in fact, there are Christians that are all over the world. I have more connection to a Christian in Nigeria spiritually than I do to someone who is not a Christian in the United States. So that national identity just doesn't matter, and we're all bonded together as a as the family of God, and that should be our primary identity. And I think the one of the most important lessons we can take about this away from the Bible is in the book of Acts. And there are two really, I think, compelling narrative streams in Acts that kind of demonstrate how this all comes together. The first and one of the most beautiful is in Acts chapter 4, where Peter stands in front of the Sanhedrin after doing all of these very powerful signs in front of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And the Sanhedrin's like, we really don't like what you're doing. You're going to have to stop. And Peter says, well, I don't know if we have to listen to you, but I can't stop telling people what I have seen God do. And the Sanhedrin, they weren't just the religious authorities. The idea that there's a split between religion and politics, that's a post-Enlightenment ideal. Like, the Sanhedrin were political authorities. And so Peter was saying, okay, I know that you guys are in charge, but we're dealing with this thing that's much bigger than your political power. And no matter what you do, like, we cannot stop telling people about it. And then you have the witness of Paul in the second half of Acts. As Paul goes throughout the Roman Empire on all his missionary journeys, he comes into contact with some of the most powerful people in the Roman Empire, like proconsuls, people who had made it to the heights of Roman power. And Paul never once says, hey, I really think you need to change all of your political policies. I really need to roll back the warfare state. I need you guys to implement. He never does any of that stuff. What he does when he comes into contact with very powerful Romans is he preaches the gospel to them. That's what he does. He doesn't try to influence policy. He doesn't try to change the direction of the Roman Empire. He just preaches the gospel, and he lets that work itself out. Again, it's like, yesterday was Reformation Day. We know Romans 1:16 and 17, the gospel is the power of God for salvation. And I think Paul really, really believed that. And so for me, Christianity has always been supra political. We're like, as Christians, we're supposed to be beyond politics. Yes, that's a thing that happens in the world. And if we have the ability to push the political conversation in a direction that is more life-giving and more healing and less authoritarian, then we should. But at the end of the day, our ultimate allegiance is to Jesus. And what we do as a church goes beyond the petty politics of the world. And our conception of power and our conception of kingship needs to be shaped by the Bible. And so I think when you look at those principles, then you do see a biblical basis for libertarianism, even though the philosophy is not explicitly spelled out in the text. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really does. As you're kind of walking through some of that, I am struck by how little we see, particularly in the New Testament, of Jesus commenting on particular policies that were enforced, like legally enforced policies. Paul as well, without getting to like, Romans 13 or First Peter 2 or anything like that. But I like, there's so little where Jesus actually comments on any particular policy or anything like that. And so much of what Jesus's ethic is rooted in is voluntary, self-sacrificial love. I mean, you mentioned Philippians chapter 2 earlier, and how Jesus's model of kingship, leadership there is sacrificial. The emphasis, right, is self-sacrificial. We've seen a lot of leaders here recently who are more than willing to sacrifice other people's rights and other people's goods and services and time and energy and resources and things like that. But Jesus is, and I know this is what you meant, that Jesus's model there was self-sacrificial. His emphasis was constantly on, hey, it is incumbent upon you to ensure that that the kingdom is meeting the needs of these people who are in need of the gospel and in need of that. I do want to ask, though, despite the clear fact that we don't see, Jesus, Paul, or Peter, or anybody else commenting specifically on, policies or things like that, but aren't there times when it would be appropriate, like the civil rights movement in the 1960s, like how people based on family lineage were incapable, legally unable to do certain things like vote or stuff like that. Like, surely that's a time when a Christian could say, it is worth having the discussion on the policy and changing the policy, right? Like, help me kind of work through that distinction there, or maybe you don't feel that way at all. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand the concern that you are addressing here. and the Civil Rights Act is very complicated because there are a lot of libertarians that don't believe, and I am one of those too that don't believe in the Civil Rights Act. And I know that that sounds like very shocking, but ultimately, I think my critique of the Civil Rights Act was that it took away the ability of people to freely associate with those whom they want to. And so when it comes to trying to contextualize those sorts of things, obviously we believe that racism is wrong. And Christians were at the forefront of the abolitionist movement before the Civil War. And a lot of the very racist policies that were being combated by the Civil Rights Act were enshrined into law by Jim Crow in the South. So it was an example of the government solving the problem that it had created itself after the Civil War.
So the law, so you would argue, right? And again, sorry to jump in here.
You're good. You're good.
The laws, let's just use Jim Crow legislation as sort of the target here. The Jim Crow legislation, because it's inherently restrictive, it's anti-freedom, it's dehumanizing. That's a good way to put it. Because it's inherently dehumanizing. Would you I would say that, in that instance, in that particular instance, that I would have a duty, a Christian duty, if I could, to push to have that particular law changed.
Yes.
That would make sense, right? I would think even
absolutely. Yeah,
even from a libertarian perspective, that would make sense because those laws inherently violate the non-aggression principle, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And again, they would not have had the ability to do that in the ancient world. Like Paul he's a Roman citizen, but he's a Jew from the Eastern Roman Empire. He had no political power and he had no ability to change the policies of the ancient Roman Empire. And in modern, call America's not really a democracy. It's not really a republic either, but we do have some say, or we do at least have the ability to mount a protest against laws that we think are unjust. And I do think that Christians have a responsibility to do that. And so I am completely in favor of the spirit of the Civil Rights era. But I do think that you can make the argument, and there are very powerful and thoughtful economists like Thomas Sowell, really great Black economist, one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th and 21st century, who has made the argument against particular aspects of the Civil Rights Act because it's actually wound up making it harder for people of color to make personal decisions about their own lives and their own businesses.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of his discussion about the kind of assistance that would be offered to people depending on whether or not there was a husband in the house, something along those lines. That and I've heard him talk about that off and on, or in several venues as well. So that kind of thing is the kind of thing that you as a libertarian would say, yikes, man, that's not cool. But the I promise I'm not going to use just that clip. I'm against the Civil Rights Act. There's 1,000 qualifiers that need to be made.
Absolutely. I'm very much against racism and I'm very much against sexism and all of those things. I just need to make that abundantly clear. Yeah.
Somebody's going to cut that clip and it's going to go viral. And it's just like, oh man, no. It's like, no.
It's a philosophical legal argument. Yes.
Yeah.
And honestly, if just real quick, if I could,
go ahead.
I would love to give two book recommendations to listeners. So the first recommendation, Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, one of the best books in economics I ever read, and really helped me go further down the libertarian path. And what Thomas Sowell does,
I'm going to write that down so I can make sure to post that on the link here.
It's really good. And Thomas Sowell goes in depth into all of these economic policies that have been pursued by the United States government over the last 100 years. And he shows how all of those economic policies are either not founded in statistics, like the statistics don't bear out the success of those policies, or that they have had dramatically negative unintended outcomes. And so if you start from the premise in economics, what you have to, that intentions do not guarantee outcomes. Yes, the intention of a lot of this legislation was very, very good, trying to set the record straight, trying to right wrongs that had been enshrined in American law. But if you look at the outcomes over the last 60 or 70 years, I mean, the cornerstone of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s was the war on poverty, that we were going to solve poverty in the United States. And instead, it looks like a lot of those policies have created a permanent underclass of people that are dependent on the state, and that have been dehumanized by this legislation. And the other book that's really good is by Amity Shlaes. It's called The Great Society, and it's a history of the civil rights movement. And Amity Shlaes, in that book, she outlines a lot of the ways which, going back even to the middle of the 1960s, a lot of these civil rights policies actually hampered private charity. And there were many, like thousands of Americans that had the support that they needed to get back up off of their feet, and that the Civil Rights Act undercut a lot of those private charitable organizations, and have had a lot of very negative and dramatically disparaging unintended consequences later on down the road. Both of those books are brilliant, and they really reshape the way that we think about the Civil Rights Act, because Martin Luther King Jr. had a great vision for American society. We need to have a society where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Completely agree with that. But a lot of the political policies that were pursued to implement that vision for society have had unintended consequences. And a lot of people don't realize that many of the political problems that we are facing today are the results of the consequences of those policies that were signed into the law 60 years ago. And again, if you declare war on something in 60 years, you should have either won that war or you should have retreated and stopped fighting it, but here we are, 60 years later, still fighting the same war we were fighting in the 1960s.
Okay, well, that it makes more sense now, because when you mentioned particularly, like, one of your particular hangups with the Civil Rights Act was it's how it would hamper the ability of, like, free association. I didn't know to what you were referring, but is it the inability of extending private charity? Like, is that kind of one of the aspects of it that you particularly had in mind?
Yeah, that's part of it too. And as a libertarian, I believe in free market economics, and I think that there are very few businesses that can afford to stay in business while being explicitly racist, sexist, or bigoted. You're not going to stay in business. One, because people are not going to want to go. Yeah, there's a very small amount of a very small amount of the American population that would patronize any business that was openly racist or openly bigoted towards a group of the population. And a lot of business owners, they're more concerned about making money and getting rich than they are about discriminating against people. And Thomas Sowell has another really great book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, where he talks a lot about a lot of these dynamics. And one of the points that he makes is that even in the Jim Crow South, they put these price floors in place. So essentially it was like a minimum wage. And so white people could only get hired on to certain, like, union jobs if they were making a certain amount of money. And so what happened is you had all of these very racist Southerners that hired black people under the table because they didn't have to pay them as much as their unionized employees. Now, a lot of people would look at that and say that's discrimination, but in that state of affairs, black people were actually able to get jobs in the free market. And that demonstrates that these business owners were more concerned about productivity than they were about their personal biases. And then over time, I think people are going to adjust when they actually come into contact with people that are different than them, those personal preferences. And I think when it comes to the Civil Rights Act, like, it's a two-way street. So yes, there might be some racist bar in Alabama that only allows white people to come in and patronize their bar. All right, those things would exist if there were no, but imagine if you're a gay person and you want to set up a business that only caters to gay people. You don't want any straight people to buy from you or to engage in business with you. Should you have a right to do that? Absolutely. Would that exclude me from going to your business? Yes, but then you'd also be making the decision as a business person to say, I am going to cut myself off from that part of the market. And I believe as a libertarian, that's a right, that's a decision that everybody has the right to make. I know it sounds very, very scary for a lot of people in the modern world, but I do think that by putting some of those barriers to association in place, it actually entrenches a lot of people's biased views towards other people. And it also creates a situation where they're not going to be willing to try to freely associate or get along or go into the business of somebody else. And I know that I'm not doing, like, the best job in the world of exploring that, but there is a lot of economic research in Thomas Sowell's work and other economists that demonstrate across the board, if you look at the statistics, that those factors bear themselves out. Does that make sense where I'm coming from?
No, it really does. And I'll admit, in the list of questions that I sent you to kind of help guide our discussion here, they're really light on economics, because
I didn't prep for that one.
that is something that I personally struggle to understand. By God's grace, I passed my economics class in high school, which we only offered AP economics, and so I passed the class, but I think I got like a 1 on the AP test or something. Like, that stuff was always over my head, and so when you start talking about free markets and things like that, I I admit that I don't have the best and nuanced understanding of it. However, I feel like I have a little bit better handle on, maybe like a biblical underpinning for why libertarianism makes sense. And from a philosophical perspective, I think so. But like what you've presented, I think is reasonable. Like if we can take, for example, this hypothetical bar that you mentioned, like if you're only going to um, only going to appeal to a very small percentage of the population, and I think you mentioned a gay bar or something like that, you could make it a bar for only verifiable white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who happen to be straight and cisgendered. You could just flip it on the other side there, and again, make it for a very narrow, small part of the population. You would say that it's that might seem wild and ridiculous, but the person who wants to open such an establishment should be free to do so, and
Yes.
they should just expect to deal with the consequences of intentionally narrowing their their potential customer base, and the market, meaning how people will decide to spend their time and money and where they'll go and patron businesses. That will figure out whether or not that's going to be a successful or an unsuccessful venture. Like, have I kind of, in miniature, have I kind of captured what you're saying, Alex?
That's exactly right. And that's really the idea behind the philosophy of market competition. Like when you think about market competition, it's just simply the ability for competitors to come in with an alternative version of the product or the service that you're already providing, and to either create a better version of that product or to sell the same version of that product at a lower price. And when you have a truly competitive market, you wind up with more innovation and lower prices. That if you look at all of the data across the Western world in the last 200 years, all of the economic trends point in that direction, right? And so when it comes to something like the Civil Rights Act, if you have and it's not even the Civil Rights Act specifically, but when it comes to something like private property, let's say that you have a business and you're only going to cater to a very small section of the population. Well, this gives another entrepreneur an opportunity to come along and say, well, look, there's an entire section of the market that this business is not catering to. So we're going to come in and we're going to provide the exact same product. We're going to open it up to everyone else. Who are people going to choose? They're probably going to choose the more open business to the one that is more closed. And so it puts you at a competitive disadvantage in the marketplace to restrict who you're going to buy and to who you're going to sell your goods and services to. Again, if you believe in private property, a business owner owns their business, so it is theirs to do with what they want, but you are not going to be competitive in the marketplace, and you open yourself up to being taken out of business by somebody else who's going to offer that product to a wider portion of the market. And I think that had we just the civil rights is built on the New Deal and all this other government regulation that was implemented throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's not like there was no government regulation of the economy, and then you have the Civil Rights Act. And I think that there are a lot of like libertarian philosophers, like Murray Rothbard is a really good example of this, who have made the argument that a lot of these laws that were but the stated purpose by the politicians that enacted them were to do good in society actually prevented their competitors from being successful in the marketplace. Like there's a lot of good economic arguments behind, and we know politicians do that all the time. The lobbyists go to Washington, they buy off the politicians, and the politicians enact laws that benefit the corporations or the companies that are represented by the lobbyists. This happens all the time, and this is not a phenomenon that started in the last 10 or 20 years. This goes back. It's a long-standing American tradition to buy off politicians like that. And I think that with every government regulation, again, I think the ultimate point that we have to understand is that intentions do not dictate outcomes. So just because you have a good intention with a government regulation or a government law does not mean that in the long run, the outcomes will be what you intended them to be to begin with.
Yeah. That makes sense. You mentioned private property just a moment ago. And again, not a question that I had necessarily prepared you for, but I think it's relevant. One reason why I think I see a lot of Christians, particularly Christians who, again, on that left-right political spectrum, might find themselves center and left of center. One thing that a lot of them would kind of be hesitant about is the notion of private property, because in the minds of many people, it seems inherently selfish, right, to say, like, well, this is my property, and you don't have a right to take it because, I've worked for it, or like, my land and my work and my family's work like generated this, resource or whatever it is. In the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, we see a kind of an interesting perspective on private property, and this is kind of what I want your perspective on. Take Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, for example, the end of those chapters where we see a couple of summary statements of how members of the church are handling their private property. They give it away, they give it away. From a libertarian perspective, wouldn't that seem to suggest that maybe, or from a Christian perspective, wouldn't that suggest that libertarians are maybe a little hung up too much on private property, or how would a Christian libertarian kind of, navigate those waters? What would you say there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that Christians are obligated to charity. I think that that is one of the fundamental characteristics of being a Christian, is that you have to be charitable to those that are in need. With Acts, and I think this is the problem with living in a society where we just assume that the government has to have a monopoly on welfare. So if you look at the New Deal and you look at the Great Society, both of those dramatically increase government involvement in charity. But in Acts chapter 2, those that believed in Jesus voluntarily gave up what they had for the sake of the church. If you were not a Christian, you did not give up your property, and there was no attempt made by the Christians in Acts chapter 2 to convince the Sanhedrin that they needed to raise the taxes of all the people in Jerusalem in order to solve the problems of poverty and economic dislocation. And so that's what makes Christian charity so important. It's the voluntary nature of that charity. And I think that we just assume, because we are used to living in a society where the government has control over charity, that the government always should have control over charity. And it's amazing how people will read Acts chapter 2 and think that's socialism, when in reality, socialism is not voluntary. Socialism is when one party takes from another party to give to a third party, right? Whereas in Acts chapter 2, the Christians are voluntarily giving up the property that is already theirs. And again, like, people are giving it over. And what got Ananias and Sapphira in so much trouble in Acts chapter 5, it's that they said that they were going to give their property up, and they lied about that. Right. It wasn't. So that's really important. I released an episode on 1 Timothy 5 and 6 a couple of weeks ago. And in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul is dealing with the problems in Ephesus of women who are widows. And one of the really incredible things about 1 Timothy chapter 5 is that Paul says, yes, we need to be very generous towards these widows because they're very vulnerable people in our society. But there are certain widows that don't need our charity. Like, if you're a young widow, you need to get married. You should not be on our list of widows that receive charity unless you're 60 years old. And if you are a Christian and you have a family member who is a widow, it is your responsibility to take care of them. It is not the church's responsibility to take care of them. And also within 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul nowhere says we really need to advocate our Roman consul or our Roman governor to raise taxes on the wealthy so that the Romans can come in and give welfare checks out to people in our community. It's none of that. It's the Christian community voluntarily giving up what is theirs for the sake of other people. Now, and in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul talks to the wealthy people in the Ephesian congregation. He says, look, if you are lucky enough to be wealthy, you have an obligation to use that wealth to serve those people that are in need. Like, that's a moral non-negotiable. But for Paul, that is between the person who has a lot of wealth and God. Like, you have to give that up. That is a responsibility that you have as a Christian. And if you don't do that, okay, we're not going to come and have the government take it away from you and give it to these people, but you're going to have some problems with Jesus when it comes to Judgment Day. And I think that is the consistent model for charity throughout the New Testament. It's voluntary charity, but it is charity that demonstrates what does James say? Like, true faith is that takes care of widows and orphans, right? It comes from, I think, James chapter 2, right? But that is a voluntary model. And I think that we're so used to having the government control welfare that we just assume that the only way for Christians to be charitable is if they get the government involved. And this is where a lot of progressive Christians, especially the ones that I see on Twitter, get the economic component of this wrong and the biblical component of it wrong, is they gloss that over. They think, okay, Jesus was all about charity, and the New Testament says a lot of things about charity, therefore we need socialism. But I think it's a bad idea to let the government that is $34 trillion in debt and that has been at war in the Middle East since before I was born have a monopoly control over charity. It just doesn't sound like a good idea to me. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a very efficient way.
Pretty poor track record there,
Yes. And again, if you look at the economic data, and I've recommended Thomas Sowell, and I know at the end of the show I'll recommend a couple more books for your listeners, but if you look at the economic data, I think that we can demonstrate that America's welfare programs have actually had they've actually done more harm to the people that they were intended to help than they've actually served them and allowed them to alleviate the pain that comes from poverty.
Yeah, yeah. I find it woefully misguided when people point to Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4 and will try to make an argument that this is somehow an apology for apology in like a classical sense of a defense for socialism. One of the reasons why, and I don't think this is a hot take, but like I generally try to keep my political opinions less public, although I'm having you on my show and agreeing with a lot of what you said, so maybe I'm not doing such a great job of that. But at least when it comes to like, recommending particular candidates here or there, I won't do that publicly because I know that some people might have a problem of differentiating, Kevin the private individual versus Kevin the authority figure at church. So like that's my personal choice, and I don't bind that on any other minister. Just you want them to be careful. But one of the reasons why I find the argument that Acts 2 and Acts 4 promote socialism, why I find that argument so laughable and also woefully misguided, is that in one of the things that's inherent to a socialist system is the acting of or the threat of force in order to remove from someone that for which they've worked and then redistribute it. Ideally, the redistribution is equitable. What happens in practice, however, is that the redistribution is rarely equitable. It's rarely just. It so often goes primarily to those in power, and then may trickle little by little, if at all, to those who might actually need it.
Right.
And so, what Jesus advocated for, and what we see the early church doing, you're absolutely right to use the word voluntary. You're also absolutely right, I think, to emphasize that Christians should feel a spiritual obligation. They should feel a moral obligation to help at least those within the church. And then like there's some room for debate of like, whom should Christians help? Yes, obviously people in the church, but like how much do we help people outside the church? Okay, like there's room for debate with that. But I think the main thing that we should be able to recognize pretty easily there is that that giving was voluntary. Jesus's self-sacrifice, beautifully depicted in Philippians 2, was voluntary. He gave himself up. And so that's one of the things that I think Christians ought to be much more sensitive to, is that when we begin to advocate for the state to have a hand in doing that which Christians should be doing, what we're ultimately saying is, we need to fulfill the will of God through the use of the state, through the use and threat of force. And that's one thing that I've seen you and I, particularly you, but I know on the episode that I did with you several weeks ago on ministering in politically divided times, that was one thing that I really felt comfortable verbalizing, maybe for the first time publicly, was, we talked about Christian nationalism and Christian progressives, and how, like I was arguing that both are rival denominations of the same religion, and the religion is the worship of the state and the use of state power to effect the kingdom of God. And I just don't see Jesus authorizing us to do it anywhere near to the degree. Like, yes, we've talked earlier in the episode, yes, there's a time and place for us to use political processes to, get rid of dehumanizing laws and increase freedom and liberty for others. Yes, I think there's a time for that. But to do what a lot of Christian nationals and Christian progressives who would presumably not have anything in common, they actually do have something pretty significant in common, and it's because that they're using the threat and force of the state in order to effect what Jesus ultimately said you ought to do self-sacrificially. I'm not even going to try to tack a question on the end of that. I'm just going to let you take
Yeah,
over
that's
because I know you're
perfect.
chomping at the bit.
No, that was perfect. I actually wrote an article over on Libertarian Christian Institute's website that came out just a couple of weeks ago called Progressive Christian Nationalism, where I make that exact same argument that the progressive Christians are structurally the exact same as Christian nationalists. It's so important, and you really did a great job of highlighting this, that we have to understand all of these things as being done voluntarily. Now, I know a lot of progressives, and I know that they have the best of intentions, and they're very
Sure.
compassionate people, and they're
Sure.
extremely well-meaning. But it is neither kind nor charitable nor sacrificial to demand that one group of people with guns goes and takes money from another group of people to give to a third group of people. There's nothing loving about that at all. And so when you just think about it philosophically, which is all, whenever we say that we want to raise taxes on certain people, or that we want to implement a new tax or whatever, that's all that we're saying. We want the IRS, which is armed with guns and backed by the force of the federal government, to forcibly take money from one group of people to give to a third group of people. The other problem with that too, and Amity Shlaes talks about this a little bit in her book on the Great Society, is that charity is best done at the local level, because at the local level, you know the needs of your community. Like, I live in Independence, Kentucky. I know who is in need. I kind of know my way around. We kind of know which families struggle and everything like that. And when you centralize welfare in the hands of people that are far away, then they wind up creating arbitrary benchmarks for people that receive that money. So, like you said, they tax the American people. You have to spend billions of dollars a year on the bureaucrats that distribute this money and that decide where it's going to go, and then all of the offices and all of the logistics that it takes to give those money to the people that receive them. But then there's no personal connection to those people receiving the money. So you just have these dependents that look to the federal government, and if they can meet those minimum benchmark qualifications for welfare, then you've created another dependent, and you've made it very easy for them to divorce themselves from their community and just rely on somebody from far away. And Amity Shlaes talks about that effect, that there were a lot of communities, especially cities in the 1960s, that were dealing with real problems of poverty. And a lot of those poverties were caused by racist laws that were implemented throughout the United States. Like, that's very legitimate. But the private charities that were there, they knew the people that needed the money. They knew who didn't need the money. And they were able to take all of that money that was charitably given and give it specifically to the people that were needed there. So charity was done much more officially at the local level, privately, through organizations that actually had a relationship with the people that were receiving that money, instead of dehumanizing these people by just sending them a check from on high if they meet a certain level of benchmarks. And I think that, like, as Christians, we don't think about it philosophically or historically like that. I think a lot of progressive Christians with the best of intentions see passages on charity in the New Testament, and then they automatically assume that because our framework in the 21st century for charity is a government monopoly on charity, that we therefore need the government to raise taxes, and that's going to solve our problems. Not only is that not the biblical model, but I don't think that works in the long run. I think it winds up keeping people permanently in a situation where they're reliant on the government. And again, if you look at like the government schools that we send kids that are in the inner cities to, like, they're just not getting the skills that they need to go out and create their own meaning in their life. They don't know what they don't have the ability to have autonomy because they were never taught that, and the system is almost designed to hold them down in that sense. And I think that's one of the most cynical things about the government monopoly on welfare, is that we don't actually care about restoring the whole person. Like, we don't actually care about people reaching their full potential and achieving all that they can. We just care about, oh, we've given this person a check, therefore we've done our due diligence. And there are plenty of Christians that think that that's what it means to be charitable, and it's just, that model is not biblical, and it doesn't work economically either.
And I would also tack on too that that's technically a non sequitur, right? I mean, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise that, Jesus says, whenever you give alms, right, whenever you give to the poor. I mean, it's not like if. It says very specifically in Matthew 6, whenever you do this, do it in this way. Well, like, whenever that happens, I see Jesus talking to disciples, which implies to me, at least, that Jesus is putting the responsibility on the disciples to be the ones who are doing the giving. There's several steps that are missing there. If you were to say, well, yeah, Jesus says give to the poor, so therefore we need to go through all these processes to raise these taxes in order to ensure that these people might eventually get what they need to get. That I would argue that that's also technically a non sequitur. Hey, this is Kevin with Faith in the Folds. Thanks so much for listening to the first half of my conversation with Alex. We had so much to talk about, and since the U.S. is gearing up for another election cycle, this is a very timely topic as well. Because he and I ended up talking for almost 2 hours, I've split our episode into 2 parts. So this was part 1. Part 2 will release next week. As always, thank you so much for tuning in today.